Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the 9th webinar in this Offshore Wind series, Learning from the Experts. I am Jana Herndon, Project Manager with NYSERDA's Offshore Wind team, and it is my pleasure to be joined by today's expert, Kris Ohleth, with the Special Initiative on Offshore Wind, who will be giving a presentation on offshore wind stakeholder engagement. Before I introduce our speaker, a few reminders for participants and some background information on this webinar series. Next slide, please. Thank you. Firstly, if you are experiencing any technical issues, please contact Sal Graven at the email address on the bottom of this slide. This webinar is being recorded, and the recordings and presentation slides for all webinars in the Learning from the Experts series will be available on NYSERDA's website at the address on this slide. All participants have been muted. We will have time for Q&A following the presentation, so please use the Q&A function to submit your questions for the speaker throughout the webinar. Next slide, please. Thank you. New York State is working to advance the responsible and cost-effective development of at least 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2035. Offshore wind is a critical component in achieving the state's goal of 70% renewable sources of electricity by 2030 and 100% zero-emissions electricity by 2040. While offshore wind has been providing clean energy to other parts of the world for several decades, this industry is brand new to New Yorkers. To provide interested stakeholders and members of the public with accessible, impartial information and opportunities for engagement on specific topics of interest, NYSERDA is hosting this educational webinar series called Learning from the Experts to connect the public with independent experts in key topics in offshore wind. We endeavor to select Learning from the Experts speakers based on their expertise, not necessarily for an alignment of opinions with NYSERDA or the state of New York. If you would like to suggest a topic or speaker for a future webinar, you can email us at offshorewind@nyserda.ny.gov. Please note that the views and opinions expressed in this presentation are those of the presenter. Next slide, please. It is now my pleasure to introduce Kris Ohleth. Kris has worked in the offshore wind industry for over 15 years, since the days of the industry's inception in the U.S. Holding senior positions with offshore wind developers, NGOs, state agencies, she has gained critical insights into the policy and regulations that shape offshore wind activities at the state, regional, and federal levels. Kris has extensive experience working with offshore wind stakeholders and has expert knowledge of such engagements, having worked on offshore wind and ocean policy issues for nearly 2 decades. In her current role as the director of the Special Initiative on Offshore Wind, she leads the organization on to develop strategies to support the responsible and sustainable development of the offshore wind industry. Originally from New Jersey, she is a Rutgers graduate, has a master's degree from the University of Rhode Island, and currently lives in Morris County, New Jersey, with her husband and retired racing greyhounds. Thanks very much for joining us, Kris. We're very happy to have you, and I'll now turn things over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks to NYSERDA for allowing me to share with you all today. As Jana mentioned earlier, it is true that you can email NYSERDA and ask to be a presenter, because that's what I did. After hearing the previous excellent 8 topics that have been presented in part of this series, I thought, why don't we talk about stakeholders? Because that is the topic that's nearest and dearest to my heart and really central to the work that I've done in offshore wind. Just wanted to give you a little bit of information about my background, and a picture is worth 1,000 words, so I've heard. On the left-hand side of the slide, you'll see kind of what my life was like about 20 years ago before I went to grad school, when I spent a bunch of time working on vessels for NOAA Fisheries on their survey fleet, which ironically, if you're following the fisheries conversation and offshore wind, is a topic that we are addressing now in terms of the survey issues and offshore wind placement. So I guess life does come full circle. On the right-hand side of the slide, that's kind of me more recently when I used to get out and talk to people, not just from behind a computer, and spend a lot of time in the community presenting about offshore wind and really hoping to bring forth community members as they learn more about these topics. So, just on this slide here is a smattering of my background. Did get to work with NYSERDA when we were working on the New York Offshore Wind Master Plan. And we're going to talk a little bit about the engagement process that was part of that master planning experience as well. So thanks so much for allowing me to be here today. I have been in the industry for about 15 years now, and it never fails that my mother continues to ask, have you built a wind farm yet? And I have to tell her, no, not really. We haven't. We certainly, of course, have the Block Island Wind Farm and the 2 turbines off of Virginia, but we are looking to bring offshore wind farms at scale to the US and really doing that with all of the community members on board. A little background on the special initiative on offshore wind. We were established in 2013 as an independent project that supports the advancement of offshore wind as part of the comprehensive solution to the most pressing energy problems and issues facing the United States. Certainly, we see offshore wind as, especially in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic regions of our country, as the only at-scale solution to addressing the threats of climate change and the just and equitable transition from a fossil-based energy system to one that's clean and renewable. So we've been working since 2013 on policy initiatives at both the state and federal level, and also working on some stakeholder-related products that I'll mention at the end of the webinar that I hope you'll look out for as they continue to be developed. Well, I wanted to talk about why engagement is important to begin with when we're thinking about developing really anything that gets developed, but particularly something like an offshore wind farm that is very new to the United States and really needs a lot of bringing along with the stakeholder community. Listed on the slide here, the top 3 logos represent 3 wind farms that never happened. So, starting back about 15 years ago when the industry was starting to be developed, we saw a lot of local opposition from stakeholder groups. For example, the Long Island Offshore Wind Park from FPL Energy. That was quite some time ago, but organized opposition groups delayed that project and resulted in contracts missing their guaranteed construction starts, and therefore the project did not happen. The Blue Water Wind Delaware project, that project I got to work on very closely and intimately at my time at Blue Water Wind. There was a rejection of cable landfall by the folks in Bethany Beach, Delaware, which delayed state permits and then again resulted in missing the construction start date. So eventually the power contract was canceled. The Cape Wind project certainly had its share of challenges from the stakeholder space. And fortunately, the 4th logo on the slide, the Block Island Wind Farm, was able to be built. But there were definitely some points there where things were tenuous. There was over a year of delay based on concerns about the landfall location. And that project was ultimately built, but part of it was learning about allowing sufficient time in the power contracts to commence construction, because with any infrastructure projects, there can be certainly challenges, and we've seen those. And I guess I would offer that we're seeing a lot of these issues continuing as we look at building larger wind farms and building them at scale and attempting to meet our national target for offshore wind development of 30 gigawatts by the year 2030. And so what I want to think about today with you and talk about and hopefully get your questions and feedback on in the last bit of our time today over this next hour is to really think about how we can evolve, how we can move past a model where we are, there's a model known in the stakeholder space called announce and defend. And that is essentially how one does not want to develop an offshore wind farm or any infrastructure project for that matter. And so really bringing community members along and helping the project be something that can serve multiple communities as we strive to meet our energy targets. I want to talk a little bit about who the stakeholders are for offshore wind. And there's even controversy around this word. Sometimes people say, I don't want to be called a stakeholder. I find that offensive. But really, the way I think about and embrace the word stakeholder is thinking about anyone who uses the ocean. It's anyone who pays a utility bill. It's anyone who breathes the air from a fossil fuel plant. It's anyone who lives on this planet. So in my mind, we are all stakeholders in the offshore wind space. And it is my goal, frankly, every day to tell someone who does not know about offshore wind about offshore wind. And so, if you're lucky enough to be standing next to me in ShopRite in line, I'll strike up a conversation and I'll say, oh, hey, it looks like you're going down the shore. Did you know that there's going to be some wind farms built off the coast of Long Island that, maybe you'd like to learn a little bit more about? So for me, really educating the community, getting their feedback and putting it into this feedback loop is super important. And I do consider us all to be equitable stakeholders in this process, whether it's someone who's developing a wind farm, someone who's benefiting from a wind farm, someone who's being impacted from a wind farm. We are all part of this larger ecosystem of stakeholders. And so now, because I hate talking for long periods of time, I would like to bring you into the conversation with a poll question. And the NYSERDA technical team is going to help me by putting up a poll, and would love for you to spend the next 90 seconds or so thinking about and answering this question. And then we are going to display those poll results because I'm curious to hear a little bit more about what prominent concerns you're hearing from your community. You can select all the appropriate answers that apply to you. And we'll give you about another 60 seconds or so to think about and check those boxes and see where we are. All right, keep those answers coming in. And if you are in the other category and type in number 6, maybe you can share that as part of the chat so that we can see that later on as well, because very interested to see where folks are lining up on this. Okay, we'll have about another 30 seconds or so to answer. I will take a drink of water in the meantime. Okay, about another 10 seconds, and then the technical team will display the poll results for us. Okay, let's have a look. Looks like leading the pack, that 50% are impacts to existing ocean users. We have that listed here as commercial fishing, recreational fishing, and then other maritime uses like shipping. In second place, environmental issues such as impacts to wildlife and environmental justice. Not great at math. The third place is other. So get those other comments back through the chat to us, please. Viewshed impacts coming in at 24%. And then local impacts at landfall locations and cost. Oh, I'm sorry. So I misread that. Other is only 3%, not answered is 35%. Totally fair. I don't blame you if you didn't feel like answering. But good to know that we've captured all but 3% of these prominent concerns. Generally speaking, and feel free to remove the poll results from the screen now. Thank you. These have been traditionally the most prominent community concern that we have seen over the years. And when I put them here on the slide, I didn't really put them in any particular order, but certainly depending on the project location and the community members involved, we see different levels of issue, concern, impact based on that specific project. So thank you so much for answering that. We are going to have another poll coming up in just a bit, so stay tuned for that. One of the concepts I wanted to talk about in thinking about engaging with stakeholders is that there's really a spectrum of working with community members. And when we are thinking of ourselves, if we are, which I am, as a proponent of offshore wind industry, of wind energy, we're thinking about not only cultivating support, but addressing opposition and really everything that's in between of that. When we do general polling of the public to understand what their perspectives are on offshore wind, we find that most coastal community members have a favorable opinion of offshore wind. General polling usually shows over 80% in those coastal communities support offshore wind. However, there can be, very strident and vocal members of the community who do not support offshore wind. And certainly there will be points where perhaps they will never support offshore wind. Sometimes we work to develop projects that avoid, minimize, and mitigate impacts to a point where a community can at least come to a neutral position on the project. And I think that is where we stand, as we're thinking about developing several of the offshore wind projects now, so that, for example, if there is a specific viewshed concern, how can the project be modified through, for example, having automatic detection lighting systems so that lights are only triggered once an aircraft is in the air near a wind farm. So that reduces the visual impact. So it's working with the communities, getting feedback on what would help them accept the project and maybe at least becoming neutral, so to speak, on the project as opposed to opposing the project itself. Through NEPA, or the National Environmental Policy Act, there is an opportunity for formal feedback on offshore wind farms. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM, are the lead federal agency in the NEPA process. But being in the community early and often and getting feedback on projects can help developers and communities adjust project design. And these changes can really help obviate or limit the amount of project objections that show up in these more formal processes. So some of these opportunities include the scoping process for the notice of intent as part of this National Environmental Policy Act process. And there are several offshore wind farms right now that are in that notice of intent stage. And you can learn more by going to the BOEM website, which is boem.gov, and then clicking on Renewable Energy State Activities. And you can learn much more about what's going on in New York and the other Mid-Atlantic and Northeast states. But there are several notices of intent that are currently open and available for commenting. Draft environmental impact statements have their own commenting periods, and then certainly before that final environmental impact statement is issued, there's another formal opportunity for comment. Now, in addition to this, which I did not include on the slides, is that there are state processes, and depending on which state you are located in or the project is making landfall, there will be opportunities to comment through state processes as well. So, I think thinking about these formal opportunities as well as some of the less formal opportunities through open houses and direct engagement with state and federal regulators as well as project developers, it's really two important branches to think about and ways to be delivering feedback to on the projects. One thing that has been, I think, kind of an interesting double-edged sword for stakeholders as we developed Offshore Wind project is the project design envelope approach that BOEM adopted guidance for back in January of 2018. And essentially, this is a model that has been used in Europe to help advance offshore wind development for quite some time. But what it does is it provides an opportunity for the project developer, when they submit their construction and operation plan to the federal agencies, to provide a range of alternatives. And this particularly helps in an industry like offshore wind, where technology is advancing so rapidly. And so with that range of alternatives, a developer can specify, well, we think the turbine could be in this, well, we know that it would be in this project envelope range. And so you can provide the minimum and maximum thresholds. And then this way, if there's a small part of the project that changes, let's say the project turbine is now 25 feet taller, the project can still be considered under the current permitting documents. However, sometimes this can be confusing for stakeholders because then there's some uncertainty over, well, which turbine are you using? How tall exactly will it be? What type of lighting mitigation system will you use? And as the timelines for offshore wind development are quite long, meanwhile, the technology advancements are quite rapid, having a project design envelope really seems like a great feature in working through the project development designs. And I mean, really continuing on this concept of having early engagement, it really can be a double-edged sword because it can provide feedback into the development of a lease area or a project design. However, it can lack sufficient detail to satisfy some of the more particular questions that are asked. So if you're developing an offshore wind project and you are then in the community, but you're early on, sometimes you'll get inquiries from local mayors, for example, on the specific benefits to their community or specific engineering details that need to be cleared up. And so there's this balancing act between being in the community too early while having enough information to satisfy those stakeholders. And it's something that I know as my time as a project developer, we really, weighed heavily. I personally have always been a proponent of being in the community early and explaining that, these are long lead time projects, that there are things we don't yet know. And really one of the benefits of not having all of those project decisions completely solidified at that point is giving stakeholders the opportunity to discuss trade-offs and for other options to be considered. So for example, when you go to a community and say, okay, well, we're considering building an offshore wind farm here, and we have these type of parameters we need to satisfy when we're considering a landfall location. And when we're taking a desktop look at this environment, we see that there are three options that would make most sense for us. And so can we have a focus group in the community to understand the trade-offs between those different potential landfall locations? Some cost more money, some have more disruption in the community because they have a longer length in terms of impacts and in the roadways. So it's really a great in my opinion, to be in the community early on and be able to bring in stakeholders to discuss those trade-offs. Another thing that early engagement can do is give offshore wind proponents the opportunity to lead more with the why an offshore wind farm can be so important to addressing the impacts of climate change, to stimulating economic development. There really are a whole host of benefits, and leading with those whys as opposed to what of the project development can be more engaging and really can hopefully help community members, ocean users, stakeholders understand literally why it is we're doing this anyway. And really, that early engagement can help us move past the decide, announce, and defend model, where we're in this reaction mode about, okay, well, here's the wind farm, and now you tell me everything that's wrong with it. If we're in a place of earlier engagement, we have this opportunity to be able to modify a wind farm. And, I'm not so naive to think that those modifications will get to unanimous support for a wind farm. We talked about that earlier, but there are certainly some project concerns that can be addressed. For example, when I had the opportunity to work for Ørsted, we were working on New Jersey's Ocean Wind project. And one thing we learned from discussing the project with New Jersey Audubon and some of the other environmental groups is that they are able to be supportive of offshore wind farms once they're at least 10 miles from the coast, because then we understand that those migratory corridors are clear for those for those migration patterns. And so when the Ocean Wind project was first proposed, it was about 8 miles from shore, but then the project was reconfigured so that it was further from shore to help respect that type of request from that very important community member. And so that is the type of response that can be incorporated into a project when engagement is early. Now, thinking about the community of developers who are building wind farms, their coordination and collaboration is a really interesting subject to me. I think about the coordination and collaboration really to be critical to the success of the offshore wind industry, but it certainly can be challenging in this early stage when competition is really strong and really hot right now. There's also delicacies around not triggering anti-competition rules. And so they need to be respected very closely. And really, there are trade groups like the American Clean Power Association and the Business Network for Offshore Wind who can help the industry coordinate and collaborate, especially on some of the regional science entities like ROSA, the Regional Offshore Science Alliance, and the RWSE, which I think has a brand new name now or will soon, which is something that was originally stood up through New York's good work on regional science collection. So I think it's interesting to think about the developer community as stakeholders in the process themselves. I spent a lot of time as a developer in my previous lives where I was, kind of doing that outreach from the developer perspective, but the developer themselves are also stakeholders in this process. And so I think expanding our thoughts about that approach can be really helpful. In fact, I did some brainstorming and thought up a list of when, developing a stakeholder engagement plan, some of the categories that you might consider thinking about for stakeholder groups. And so I've listed those on the slide, some of those on the slide here, and depending on where a project is located, maybe these groups are kind of more or less critical to project development. For example, submarine cables and offshore infrastructure. That's what I listed as category 11. These are in no order of importance, but if you're developing a project off the coast of New York or New Jersey, where there's a really large confluence of buried cables and pipelines, well, then this group of existing users in the ocean space will be really critical for engaging with. However, there are other parts of the coast of the US that don't have such a strong confluence of cables and pipelines. So therefore, in that case, maybe that project doesn't have such a strong demand to be engaging with those folks. Another topic that I wanted to cover is the importance of using spatial data to inform stakeholder engagement. And we have the incredible fortune of having regional data portals. The one I am showing a screenshot of here is the Mid-Atlantic Ocean Data Portal. There is also a sister portal in the Northeast. These are free and 100% accessible to anyone who would like to see them. If you go to midatlanticocean.org, and I'm forgetting the name of the exact URL in the Northeast, but certainly a quick Google search would help you find it. And by checking out these online data portals, you can turn on and off different layers and see where wind farms are proposed, where the landfall cables are proposed, where fishing activity is. And while offshore data sets are challenging and most are not perfect, it does give you a place to start in thinking about where shipping lanes are and where you may find more sensitive habitats, where there may be stronger areas of environmental concern. So really encourage you to take time to use the data portals, take a look at them, and when you're working with stakeholders and folks in your community, perhaps it's a resource you can use to help share information with them. Okay, we would love to turn to another poll question with you. So we are turning now essentially to the more tactical portion of the presentation this afternoon. And I would like you to spend the next 90 seconds addressing this next poll question, which, just out of curiosity, would like to hear more about what type of outreach events you have attended. There are 6 options a part of the poll, and if you have not attended any of them, feel free to just not answer. So again, we'll give you about 90 seconds to answer this poll question. And I will again take another drink of water. Okay, about another 45 seconds or so. And another 15 seconds. Great, thank you so much for getting those responses in. Just kind of right off the bat, something interesting to note about the poll question itself is that now in this, kind of COVID time, we have all these options for virtual engagement, and I think we are going to be displaying our poll results here shortly. So take a look at your screen and let's see what we've got. Yeah, a lot of good virtual stuff going on. It certainly, what's interesting is it allows for, the way I've been thinking about it is it allows for maybe additional quantity of people or ideas to be involved, but maybe not the same level of quality of engagement. And as much as I'd like to think that all the folks here on the line today, you're benefiting from the opportunity to come together and hear and think about stakeholder engagement, at the same time, being in person and being able to share, especially on this topic, I feel would be very powerful. But I'm grateful that we are in a time where we have the opportunities to go virtual. However, I am looking forward to, being in person, being able to develop those relationships. And I don't know about you, but I feel like the relationship building is more challenging in the virtual environment. Fortunately, I've had the opportunity to build relationships up to now. And so calling on those relationships that are already established seems a bit more reasonable. So good to see that there is strong engagement from the folks on this line. I figured that many of you who are attending today have been participating in the industry thus far. So thanks for sharing on that. I'm going to go through some of the examples of engagements that are led by federal agencies, by state agencies, and then by developers or other entities. Because really, there are really many different facets and responsible parties when reaching out to stakeholders and receiving feedback and really bringing along our communities while we develop offshore wind farms. Federal agencies certainly have an important role and responsibility in this. And as we discussed earlier, the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, the NEPA process, affords for comment periods that are required and formalized and done through the Federal Register. In addition to just BOEM, the lead federal agency, other consulting agencies will also contribute to the review of the documents that developers submit, and also then, will, based on the documents they'll be issuing, for example, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, will review and issue incidental harassment authorizations, for example, where developers submit plans for either their surveys or their construction, and using modeling predict how much sound will be in the environment due to those activities. As a result, then, NOAA Fisheries can issue an IHA, or an incidental harassment authorization, and there are comment periods associated with that and opportunities to give feedback. So really, the federal family has an entire, we could do an hour on that alone, on how to comment and how to get comments on the record. Fortunately, I think now that we have a relatively streamlined system, it's pretty straightforward on how to submit those things. In addition, really great engagement opportunities are done through when BOEM particularly develops guidance on a certain topic. So, for example, guidance on how to collect data for a geophysical or geotechnical survey. There's opportunities to give input into those guidance documents as they're developed by the federal regulator. You may have seen, if you're interested in New York offshore wind, that there is a proposed sale notice that is out for comment, and a final sale notice for the New York Bight that we would expect in the coming months. In that proposed sale notice, for the really first time, you'll see that there are requirements for engagement by the developer who would be bidding on those lease areas that are designated in the proposed sale notice. And that's really, I think, very emblematic of where the Biden administration is on offshore wind, recognizing that community members, user groups, stakeholders, however you would call them, are a super important component to building offshore wind farms. Because as we know, there are thousands of turbines that are spinning around the world. So it is no longer a huge technical feat, even though they're very cool, building an offshore wind farm. However, it is a challenge to help all the community groups understand why it's important and help the projects, really help the projects fit in with that community. And through these proposed sale notice stipulations, the lessees who are awarded those new lease areas will be required to engage in certain types of conversation, for example, with the tribal nations, with the fishing community, with the environmental justice groups. So that's really an evolution that we've seen in offshore wind over the past decade or so that I think is very positive. Some examples of engagement led by state agencies are listed here on the slide. NYSERDA, who are hosting today's webinar, developed an offshore wind master plan a few years ago. And as part of that, you can see on the offshore wind master plan website, which I believe is still active, that there was a full stakeholder engagement plan that was developed in tandem with that. And I'm proud to say that I had the opportunity to play a role in that and rolling out some of the open houses that were associated with that work. So, states are doing a great job. The Ocean Special Area Management Plan that Rhode Island developed, I guess that was a decade ago at this point, had extensive stakeholder engagement and review involved. And, I still believe that it was because of that OSAMP and that special area management plan that, really there was the ability for stakeholders to understand, what the benefits of the projects were, what the potential impacts were, and, through that process, enable the project, our first in the US to be built in 2016. So really kudos to Rhode Island and that special area management plan, always doing so much to be really thoughtful in bringing stakeholders to the table. And then certainly in many states, up and down the coast, there are state-led working groups, whether they focus on wildlife or supply chain or maritime issues, a whole host of issues. State-led working groups have a really important role to play in some of those kind of smaller group working group style meetings and have been really beneficial. There are different categories of meetings and engagements that are led by private entities. I would say, by and large, that is done by the project proponents. However, you'll see trade groups or other organizations leading things like open houses, providing a wind farm tour, whether that's of Block Island or Seavow in Virginia, or even hosting delegations to see wind farms in Europe. Small group meetings, so really digging down into the issues. Just harkening back to my time with Ørsted, had the opportunity to host a variety of environmental NGO working group meetings to do deeper dives on things like what does it mean to do horizontal directional drilling in the environment, and have those small group technical meetings. And then really all the way down to the one-on-one meetings. And those are great. Really, the relationship building and getting that one-on-one feedback is really, really a special opportunity. I just wanted to close out my portion of the comments today with an African proverb that I've been thinking more and more about lately, which says, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I think that working with community members, ocean users, and stakeholders, and bringing them all along with the newly developing industry of offshore wind will help us go farther together. And so I look forward to your questions. We have about 15 minutes or so together, and I really appreciate your time today. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kris, for that great presentation. So glad to have you speaking on this really important subject. This is certainly something that NYSERDA has been prioritizing, as you mentioned, since the inception of the offshore wind program with our master plan, and has evolved ever since. So glad you could speak more to the different ways that stakeholders can get engaged. And I have some questions to that effect. I'd like to encourage others to please submit their questions for Kris through the Q&A function, and we will get to as many as we can. So to start with, Kris, I wonder, sorry, my computer is going a little haywire. 1 second while I pull up the questions one more time. Okay. For folks interested in engaging in offshore wind for the first time, how would you recommend that they begin? What is a good entry point?
Oh, that's a really great question. And I know as I was going through the information for today's webinar, I was trying to trim it down so that it wasn't too overwhelming, because there certainly are a lot of entry points. I would say that, and I'll just make an assumption, that there is perhaps a project that is geographically most closely centered to you. So let's say, for example, you're most interested in the Empire Wind project that's being built off the coast of New York. Well, it's going through the development, not through the building yet. But what I would recommend first is going to the state activities page as at boem.gov. Click on, so you'll click on boem.gov, then renewable energy, and then there'll be a drop down menu for state activities. You can then go to New York and get a project update on what's going on with Empire Wind, what the status of that is. You can see who the federal regulating lead would be for that project for the state of New York. You can reach out to them specifically with questions. And then on that website, depending on the status of the project, there will be all the documents that have been filed as part of that project, And so I feel like going through the regulator can be the most objective source of information. Not saying that project developers don't give objective information, but maybe they don't. Maybe, you know, they are more of a project advocate. And so if you're looking for, more unbiased information, BOEM does a great job of putting that information out there.
Great, thank you. Another question here, how have stakeholder concerns or objections to offshore wind development changed over time? Are you hearing new or different concerns?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, when the special initiative was formed in 2013, the biggest concern, and this was actually, we were formed around a request by the state of New York. So it kind of feels like old home week for me to be here today. But we were formed because the state wanted to understand how much offshore wind would cost. And they were concerned that as procurements proceeded, it would be too costly for ratepayers to absorb. And they wanted to understand what instruments they could implement that would over time reduce the cost of offshore wind. Essentially, what was the roadmap to cost reduction? And so the special initiative, along with a variety of our partners, did an analysis that showed what type of leverage could be used by the state to reduce costs over time, and what type of actionable items could be included in a potential power contract with a developer that would in fact reduce costs. We did see the state implement some of those in their solicitations, which makes me very proud. And in New York and Massachusetts and New Jersey, we have seen really, frankly, low numbers coming in from developers in terms of the cost of electricity from offshore wind. And so long story short, too late. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, all the conversation was about this being too expensive of a technology. We know now that the bids have been coming in and projects are being developed, that cost isn't as much a concern. I think we're seeing more, now that projects are becoming more of a reality, we are seeing ocean users and local community members becoming more concerned about offshore wind. And it's fair, I think, in a lot of ways to expect that type of evolution, because there's this thing that's known as stakeholder fatigue, and that can be either just around one topic. So, for example, offshore wind, or it can be just among one community group, like the fishing community. So, let's take the fishing community, for example. They spend a ton of time absorbing different regulations and information and kind of external threats to their industry. And so piling on offshore wind, yet another thing, one could understand why maybe they wouldn't prioritize, focusing on offshore wind when they had things that were kind of much more kind of closely associated with their livelihoods 10 years ago. But now, as we see 30 gigawatts on the table and what that will look like in terms of cumulative impacts and really seeing the industry at scale, it would make sense to me that that group would be more concerned over time, which is in fact what we are seeing.
Thank you, Kris. And I have a follow-up question related to the stakeholder fatigue that you mentioned. In your opinion, how should developers better coordinate and improve upon stakeholder engagement processes to reduce that fatigue and that burden on stakeholders?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's not only the developer coordinating, but also the agencies who are also kind of hosting those meetings. I saw, for example, I think a really good step towards this in the Atlantic Shores open houses that were last week. Atlantic Shores is a project proposed off the coast of New Jersey, and they brought in BOEM to participate in that open house. So while that wouldn't cut down necessarily on the required scoping meetings that BOEM would do, it is at least centralizing some of the conversation through a single focus point. And then I think leaving those materials to be static, as Atlantic Shores has done on their website, can be really helpful for stakeholders who have conflicts at those times, or needed to kind of come back to something. So considering the really the what's the word I'm looking for, the really ambitious targets we have over the next decade or so in building out this industry, there is a real challenge around stakeholder fatigue, and I wish I had a better answer. It's something that I've been doing a lot of thinking about, but I think that helping entities understand those sensitivities and at least making the access, a streamlined sense of access to those, to the information, I think can be really helpful.
Thank you. I have a question on the flip side of that now, which is, how can developers facilitate follow-ups with stakeholders when there are just so many? Developers or state or federal agencies may be getting feedback that stakeholders don't feel like they have enough opportunity for engagement. But how do you balance needing to do that follow-up with just the sheer number of stakeholders that there are to speak with?
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting conundrum, because on one hand we hear that there's too much engagement and there's fatigue there, but then in other ways there's not enough. And for me, what it comes back to is, how meaningful is the engagement? So, for example, if you have serious concerns about the industry, attending an open house where there are hundreds of people, either in person or virtually there, is not as meaningful, perhaps, as having a one-on-one conversation with a regulator or a project developer. I know that there are some really very well-intentioned people in this industry who will take meetings wherever they need to be, whatever time they need to be, and getting in a request to a project developer, to their community liaison. And I know that essentially all of the developers now who are working on the East Coast have community liaisons or permitting teams who are kind of filtering in that information. The developers are building capacity, and they see, I think, that there is a strong need to do that, because I think it's the depth of the meaningfulness of the engagement is really part and parcel to that. I think maybe sometimes lack of feeling like there's a fulfillment in the conversation.
Yeah, thank you. It's a tough balance to strike, but absolutely. Another question we have here is, you mentioned that cable landfall and interconnection can be an area where stakeholders are particularly concerned. And often developers are the ones engaging with communities about this subject when there can be mistrust there. So in your opinion, who are the other voices that should be engaging on the local level in those conversations early with community members?
Yeah, and it's a really important point because I think if we're really going to be bringing community members along, which is the most successful, I think, development paradigm for bringing forth offshore wind, it really needs to be done at the community level. And this is a perfect example of how that can happen. And so, I mentioned earlier having a focus group in a local community that is comprised of thought leaders in that community. And that can be local elected officials, that can be some of the local NGO community members, that can be, religious and faith leadership, really kind of bringing them together in a focus group format and then having them bring the community voices to the table before those type of options are then socialized further. And so specifically, I can speak to some work we did around ocean wind when I was at Ørsted, where it kind of specifically went to the mayor's office and to the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection and said, here's the criteria we have. Here are a suite of options. You tell us where the best landfall location would be. And then having those people as part of the focus group endorsing that to the community and helping folks understand. Because I think, Jana, sometimes it appears that these projects just fall down out of the sky, just like, oh, okay, well, this is what we've decided. But typically, and I would say almost exclusively, there's likely years of planning that have been going on. And so bringing people in, and again, the word meaningful I'll use, in a meaningful way so that they can still influence project change, and then having them participate in the delivery of that message.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. I wonder if there is a favorite resource or guide that you'd like to direct people to in their engagements, particularly with federal and state agencies, as those processes can be intimidating.
That's such a softball. Thank you. I forgot. Is that because I forgot to say my thing, Jana, or did somebody really ask that? No, I'm kidding. I did want to share about a project that the Special Initiative worked on with then the American Wind Energy Association, now ACP, and the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which is a public participation guide. And that is something that can be viewed on BOEM's website. Jane, I'd be happy to share the link with you. I don't know if we can do that through the chat, but it essentially delineates BOEM's timeline for permitting, and not only for permitting, but all the way from the first stages of lease area identification and kind of moving through, and then really specifically drops in exactly when the formal opportunities are for stakeholder engagement. And so again, going back to formal versus informal, these would be the formal opportunities to get your comments on record. Right now, the Special Initiative is working on kind of the tandem instructions for how states would also do that. So how you could engage at the state level as well as the federal level, because it's kind of like a two-part style engagement for the permitting of these projects. So that if you just Google BOEM Public Participation Guide, that will likely come up. It's on the BOEM website, and in general, the BOEM renewable energy page is chock full of information.
Great. Thank you so much, Kris. I see that we only have about a minute left, so I'll move us to our closing slide with sincere thanks for answering all of those questions. I want to thank all of our attendees for joining us for this Learning from the Experts webinar. A reminder that this webinar recording and presentation slides will be available on NYSERDA's website. The URL is nyserda.ny.gov/osw-webinar-series. Our next webinar in the series is on August 11th. It's a good webinar to follow this one, as you may have follow-up questions. Michelle Morin and Jessica Stromberg with BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, will explain the federal process for reviewing offshore wind construction and operations plans. You can register for this webinar and future webinars in the series through our events page. The shortcut is wind.ny.gov. If you have requests for future topics you'd like to hear about in this series, please send us an email at offshorewind@nyserda.ny.gov. Thank you again for joining us today, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, Kris.